sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. My name is Naomi Kokion and I'm the Chief of Informal Learning at the library. Today I'm interviewing Tahereh Mafi, author of An Emotion of Great Delight. Thank you to our online audience for joining. This is really your session, so please ask your questions in the Q&A feature here, and we'll take them. We have about 30 minutes today, so please pose any questions you'd like for Tahereh. And Tahereh, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to talking with you. And to start us off, while we wait for the questions to come in, I'd love to chat with you about the theme of the festival, which is Open a Book, Open the World. And I wonder if there was a book that you read, especially a book maybe you read growing up, that opened the world or new worlds for you, and then also what you think or hope your book will open up for readers.
Wow, that's a great question. I want to say, I suppose the cop-out answer is that every book opened a door into a new world for me. But the slightly more unusual answer is that I think my experience as a young person was so far from the average, so far from the norm, that I often found great escape in contemporary fiction that was meant to describe the average experience. So I found, I was extremely fascinated by things like Sweet Valley High novels or like Full House novelizations, any kind of like realistic fiction that was like the most almost campy. I found that really fascinating because I thought, what is it like to be a cheerleader? What is it like to date, the high school quarterback? What's it like to be a prom queen? I found those stories absolutely fascinating. And so those were the ones I was most drawn to. They were as fantastical to me as reading Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. So those were the ones I found myself drawn to over and over again. As far as, sorry, were you?
No, just the second part of the question you're about to answer. That's fine.
So as far as what I hope my stories do for readers, I hope to do exactly the same thing. Open a door into a world that reflects the experiences that I had as a young person. And that experience might be as different and fantastical to some readers as reading Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, as I said. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we strive to do with the books that we write is to, is to open those doors to reflect back into the world different experiences. And to normalize those experiences, to pull back because when you don't know about something, it seems strange. It's the old saying, the old cliche, and we're just trying to open doors and windows into worlds that were otherwise unrepresented. Were unrepresented for so long.
Mm-hmm. Well, along those lines, I was really moved by the point you made in that video on demand, the interview you did with the teens about why you gave Shadi the struggles with her friends and her family that she has. And you said, because, some people have that experience and, if you don't, then you're lucky, but you want to say to kids who do have those challenges, I see you. And so I'm wondering, how you feel that young people have connected to this book. I mean, have you gotten much response from the audience yet about how they see themselves or are reflected in this book in a way?
Yeah, there's a range, right? So there are lots of people who have said many kind and generous things about the story, but the ones that sort of pierce me in the heart are the responses from people who really seem to understand what it feels like to carry that much weight, especially as a young person. Not to repeat myself too much, but it is interesting when occasionally you hear from people who think that maybe Shadi's struggles in the book are a little, it's unrealistic. you know, that it's like unrealistic to experience that many things, for that many things to go wrong, and for a teenager to have to carry that much weight. And I just think, like, I'm so happy for you that it seems unrealistic. Like, with all my heart, I think that's so wonderful that it seems unrealistic to you. I hope that it, you know, I don't want that experience for the average. I don't want that experience for my daughter. I hope that it is unrealistic for her. But there are so many people out there who really are struggling with that. And to hear from them, since the publication of this book, to hear that they relate to that kind of pain and to the struggle of balancing that much pain, has been really, I don't want to say it's nice, because you know, it's not exactly a nice thing, but it's nice to know that you're not alone. You know, it makes even me feel less alone.
That's a really beautiful response. And I think, you know, we are getting some questions from the online audience. And I think this question from Jasmine might tie into what we've just been talking about, which is, why did you write An Emotion of Great Delight for YA readers especially?
It's because wow, there's so many reasons how to synthesize this in a short answer. I mean, first and foremost, I wanted to write a book that felt true and reflective of experiences that I had as a young person, but also that I had seen other people have around me, in the community around me, when I was growing up. And so that was the first part of it. It was also a follow-up to my first work of realistic fiction, which followed a main character who was unlearning anger. That story was about anger and returning to happiness in her own way, or not even happiness, but just unlearning that anger. This book, I wanted to approach it from a different emotional avenue. And in this book, I wanted to explore sorrow, because you know, when I was a young person, I felt both very deeply, both anger. I was a very angry teenager because I felt extremely impotent in the face of a great deal of injustice and just, you know, the many things that were leveled against me as a young person. But also I felt a great deal of sorrow. And these were very, very different emotional avenues that I wanted to explore through different characters and different sets of circumstances. And I wrote it for young people because this was, I don't want to say exclusively, but I don't often see young people dealing with this much pain. Certainly these books exist, absolutely. I don't want to imply that I was inventing anything here, but specifically with regard to the experience of a young Muslim person, I wanted to illustrate how you can be dealing with xenophobia and bigotry and racism and all of this, and also just have a very difficult life, you know, that is riddled with all of the basic human tragedies that befall any one of us for any number of reasons. And I wanted to illustrate how backbreaking that could be. And especially as a young person with no agency, no independence, no freedom, no driver's license, no bank account, you know, it's so difficult to know how to navigate that kind of pain when you have very few tools, or you know, you are equipped with so few tools to deal with that kind of thing, and it can be very difficult. And I was trying to capture that as a way of communicating with the young people who might have experienced something similar in their own lives.
So Laura asked a question that in a way you've answered already, but I'll share it with you because it also has a lovely, a lovely compliment, which is that An Emotion of Great Delight was such a beautiful book. I could feel Shadi's pain so clearly. How have your struggles influenced this novel? Maybe you can tell us a bit about how you made the decisions to give Shadi the struggles she did, or expand more on that.
I mean, I experienced a great deal of what Shadi experienced. Obviously not exactly the same thing. This is heavily fictionalized, but the essence of it felt very real. I mean, it was a crazy time. I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened, and it not obviously, dramatically, profoundly, this absolute tragedy, this horrific tragedy dramatically affected the entire world. And somehow, on a micro scale, dramatically affected my life. And a lot of things changed for me. And it wasn't necessarily easy to be a visibly Muslim person in this world prior to 9/11, but it became a lot more difficult after that. And so An Emotion of Great Delight takes place in 2003, a few months after we have officially declared war on Iraq. And this was like an important distinction for me, because my first work of realistic fiction, A Very Large Expanse of Sea, took place in 2002. And it was a different time emotionally, politically, socially, still slightly different. And then in 2003, after we've officially declared war, things really began to change in the Muslim communities. Because, I remember this so clearly. I remember everyone being assigned FBI agents, like FBI agents infiltrating our mosques. And it was a terrifying time. People's houses being raided, everybody, randomly being called undercover FBI agents, like in our congregations. It was a very scary time. It was a very strange, surreal time as a teenager. It was, and you feel like things are just spiraling out of control. And on top of that, I was dealing with, problematic and toxic friendships. I had a sick parent, and a lot of like personal drama in my life. I didn't lose a sibling, but I have 4 older brothers, and there was a great deal of drama and difficulty in my personal life. And it just felt like everything was, and also I moved around a lot as a kid. So I was just starting over constantly and never had a chance to really root myself. And every turn I was always entering a new school as, this like terrorist adjacent stereotype. And it followed me everywhere I went. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult. And I was a very, very angry and devastated teenager, like all the time. So, a great deal of it was inspired by experiences I have had myself and the experiences I saw friends of mine deal with and grapple with as young people.
Well, I can't imagine it's easy to delve into those experiences, but we thank you as an audience for sharing, sharing your perspective and helping us better understand. So we appreciate it. And we started this conversation talking about books that opened up worlds to you and ways that you could sort of escape. This is a slightly different question from Patricia, which is, which authors did you look up to as a young reader? Were there any that inspired you, I guess, as a writer or as a reader?
Yeah. When I was very young, I read so many books. It's kind of a blur. I don't even remember what half of them were called. I was that typical, very typical, like lonely kid who spent all her time reading. So my friends were the books. That was pretty classic for me. I would go to the library. Like I spent my summers at the library. I'd read 3 or 4 books a day. Like that's what I would do. And I just remember a blur of words. I don't really remember thinking, because I never wanted to be a writer. I was never a young person. I was a reader. I've been a lifelong reader. But I never thought I wanted to be a writer. So the authors didn't really register for me. It didn't matter to me who'd written the book. Like it took me a decade to realize who wrote The Prince and the Pauper, which I used to read all the time as a kid.
Yeah.
So, that part didn't quite register. I never thought of authors as inspiring people. I just consumed stories. And but I would read. I remember the first time I read an Isabel Allende novel. that just blew my mind. It was, I remember so I was a teenager by this time. I read a lot of Isabel Allende, and I remember when I read The Joy Luck Club, that blew my mind. Amy Tan I used to read all of her books. I mean, it was very hard for me initially to find a lot of books written by women of color. And that wasn't even something that I registered actively. It was just, what I read was what was available to me. And then later, I didn't even understand why I was so drawn to authors like Isabel Allende and Amy Tan, but I would read their books all the time. Anything new that they came out with, I was just reading those. I remember that pretty clearly.
Well, sort of transitioning then from your life as a reader to your life as a writer, Sienna has a question about your process. She says, does your writing process change when you write fantasy versus realistic fiction? And if so, how?
I think it only changes in that I find writing fantasy a great deal less painful. It's more fun to write fantasy because I get to hide behind layers of metaphor. But when I write realistic fiction, it sort of extracts from me an emotional tax. I mean, writing An Emotion of Great Delight was very painful. It was very painful because I had to return to a place in my head that I did not want to visit. And I listened to a lot of sad music sad music from like 2003, like the kind of things I used to listen to back then to try and remember what that was like. And, doing research, because technically it's a work of historical fiction. I don't like calling it contemporary fiction. I mean, this is 20 years ago now. So, going back through newspapers and the headlines and remembering what that was like and rereading and reliving those experiences was hard. It was really hard. So when I write fantasy, it's more fun. It's more of an escape.
It's very understandable. And actually, I appreciate you sharing with us how you return to that moment, because that was a question I had. How do you bring yourself back to your teenage self, or keep in touch with the things, the details of the life of young people that make a book relatable and important to them. So listening to music from the time is one thing. Is there anything else though that sort of helped you, in addition to reading the headlines and listening to music, that helped you go back to that moment, or to do the research to give the background to the book?
Well, yeah, with An Emotion of Great Delight, it was more straightforward. It was more about like actual, reading through the archives of history, remembering, like literally like going through the newspapers from that time period, remembering those moments, as I've already said, with, because it was more of a straightforward, deeply, deeply emotional book. But with my first work of realistic fiction, A Very Large Expanse of Sea, that was a little more upbeat, less of a downer. And that was inspired a great deal by my experiences breakdancing in high school, because I used to breakdance in high school. And returning to that era was more fun. And so I used to breakdance with my brothers. And it was fun, like getting them together and talking about that and reminiscing and remembering. And I had to like rewatch like breakdancing videos and try to remember like what was that called and how did we do this and where did we go and what was that like? And so that was a different kind of like emotional return, and it was a bit more fun.
Mm-hmm. That sounds fun. I don't know if there are videos we could see, but that sounds like a lot of fun. But so Emily has another question about process, which is, how do you choose the titles of your books?
For my contemporary novels, So a very large expanse of sea is the dictionary definition, the Oxford English Dictionary definition of the word ocean. Who is the love interest? This is the name of the love interest in the story. And it's also a metaphor because there are oceans between them. You know, they're separated by so much. This seems like this insurmountable obstacle, this vast body of water. So that's where that came from. And for an emotion of great delight, an emotion of great delight is the dictionary definition of the word joy, which is the English definition of the name Shadi. Shadi in Farsi means joy. And this story was about Shadi finding her way back to herself. So she is navigating immense sorrow in the hopes of reclaiming joy, reclaiming herself, her own identity, who she really is. And so it's a story about returning to herself.
Thank you. And we have a, I guess, challenging question from Sandy C. Sandy says, teens today are dealing with such a complicated world, climate change, pandemic, et cetera. What should adults be telling teens to better support and empower them? Or what do you think we could be saying, I guess?
I suppose I'm wondering whether, because I think teens, no matter what is going on, I mean, at every stage, every decade, there has been like some kind of traumatic, difficult thing to deal with. And I say this to myself to remind myself that the world feels like it's ending, but we have been here before. Like, you know, World War II must have felt like really terrifying. Or, I mean, there have been so many other moments in history that like must have felt like the world was just ending and somehow we survived it. So I actually think that maybe the message is the same no matter what, no matter the decade, that like, I think, this is my personal opinion, I think that it's kind of simple, you know, like the basic messaging of what we should be saying to like people in general, which is that, you know, we should be thinking about humanity as a whole. And I think that it is, I'm sort of, I hope I'm not going to say anything that is too, okay, let me just say that I think that sometimes a great deal of our problems at large, this is not advice to the young people, but I want to say that I think in general, a lot of our problems at large in society stem from a basic lack of empathy or compassion or vested interest in the collective humanity of all people on earth. And I think when we're talking to young people, one of the most basic and fundamental things that we can do as grown-ups engaging with young people is to acknowledge them. I think sometimes we're in such a hurry to fix the problems that are around us that we forget to acknowledge the pain first. And often that is the most essential thing to do, because I think until we acknowledge that pain, we can do nothing to solve it. And we need to give young people safe spaces to talk about what's hurting them and then recognize that hurt and say, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. There's nothing wrong with feeling what you're feeling. And there is nothing wrong with you for feeling what you're feeling. And we don't do that enough. We don't give young people enough room to just feel, because we're in such a hurry to tell them what to do and how to live. And I think that's the first step, always. As for the rest of it, I don't have like a full plan.
Well, that was beautiful and heartfelt, as your answers are, and good advice for us, I think. So we have one last question, which you sort of touched on, but perhaps we can delve into a little bit more from Sienna again. She said, did libraries influence you as a teenager? You talked a bit about libraries being an escape, but is there anything else you might want to say about the role of libraries in your life or and work?
Yeah, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for libraries. 100% unequivocal truth. I would not be where I am today if it were not for public libraries. I was the child who could not afford to spend, even $5 on a book. Like, that was just impossible. That budget did not exist. And I wasn't able to afford, be able to just buy books until I became an adult. It was, I was the kind of person who would go into a bookstore. I mean, I didn't know that I was doing something wrong. I was very young, but I would go into a bookstore and I would just stand there in the shelf, in the middle of the aisle next to a bookshelf and read the book and then put it back on the shelf because I couldn't take it home. And, I used to live there. If it weren't for my library card, I wouldn't. If it weren't for libraries and the little libraries inside of classrooms, like teachers who would have little libraries in their classrooms, these amazing teachers who would, out of their own pocket pay for these books and provide them to the students. I mean, that's where I got all my books. I got them. I borrowed from anybody I could get a book from. It didn't matter what it was. I wouldn't even know what it was. And I'd just be like, I'll read it. Give it to me and I'll read it. And so that's why I also had kind of a fractured reading experience growing up. For me, it was just about anything I could get my hands on, I would read, anything at all. So libraries will always have just an epic place in my heart. Librarians, teachers, I'm just so grateful to them, and I always will be.
Well, thank you. And we're grateful to you for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you, Tahereh Mafi. Her new book is An Emotion of Great Delight. Thank you to our audience for being here, and I hope you'll continue to enjoy the book festival at loc.gov/bookfest. Thanks.
Thank you so much.